On Christmas Eve 1972, dozens of American B-52 bombers flew over the Vietnamese sky, in what went down in history as one of the largest U.S. bombing raids, Operation Linebacker 2. But that awesome flex of war muscle was totally useless. By the time the operation was over, more than a dozen aircraft had been turned to burning scrap by a venerable Soviet missile, the S-75 Vina. In this new installment of military aviation, we want to detail everything that happened in those weeks of December 1972, when Vietnam gave the United States an aerial beating, with a little help from its friends in the Soviet Union. By 1972, the situation in Southeast Asia was untenable for all parties. The Vietnam War had gone on longer than planned and was draining U.S. reserves. That is why, in December of that year, one of the largest air attack campaigns ever carried out by the United States was launched, Operation Linebacker 2, carried out by the 7th Air Force and Navy Task Force 77, between December 18th and 29th. A kind of explosive Christmas present for the Vietnamese troops. Unlike operations like Rolling Thunder, Linebacker 2 sought to psychologically subdue the enemy, destroying the main target complexes in the Hanoi and Haiphong areas. Such a mission could only be carried out by American B-52s. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress is a long-range subsonic strategic bomber that, since its commissioning in 1955, has become a fundamental piece for the projection of American power by air. As its name indicates, it is a true air fortress, capable of transporting a large amount of destructive material and carrying out sustained operations over a specific territory. It was the ideal choice to rain down fire on the most important bases in Vietnam. In total, during Operation Linebacker 2, B-52s dropped 15,327 tons of bombs in 741 flights over North Vietnam. In numbers, this looks like a landslide victory, but during the operation the United States suffered some of the most painful and humiliating casualties of the entire campaign. The main obstacle for the B-52s was a modern Soviet-produced air defense system, the venerable S-75 Vina, known as the SA-2 guideline after its NATO designation. The S-75 is basically a surface-to-air missile that uses high-altitude command guidance to hit its targets. Since its commissioning in 1957, it has become the most widely deployed air defense missile in history, largely due to its many successes in protecting the skies of the Soviet allies. In fact, it achieved the first kill of an enemy aircraft by an anti-aircraft missile. On October 7, 1959, the S-75 destroyed a Taiwanese Martin RB-57D Canberra while flying over China. Back then, the shootdown was blamed on Chinese fighters of the time to keep the Vina's power hidden. As you will see, this missile really changed the history of aviation, being a formidable enemy for any aircraft. Regarding the launcher and missile, there are numerous variants that have received upgrades over the years, but the ones that were stationed in Vietnam had the ability to launch a 195-kilogram warhead over 30,000 meters altitude with a velocity of Mach 3. In total, North Vietnam had 26 S-75 systems protecting the Hanoi and Haiphong area. This was supplemented by various combat and intercept aircraft, and some radar stations that monitored the skies. The B-52 fleet employed in Operation Linebacker 2 consisted primarily of G and D models. All D models had been upgraded with state-of-the-art electronic countermeasures, but only half of the G models had been upgraded, so they were easier to seek and destroy by the S-75 Vina. To make matters worse, the tactics of the B-52 fleet had changed virtually nothing since World War II. On December 18, 1972, 87 B-52s took off from Andersen Air Force Base on Guam. Another 42 units did the same from the U Tapao Airport in Thailand. During the first night of Operation Linebacker 2, North Vietnamese forces fired nearly 200 S-75 missiles, of which at least 5 hit their targets. That day 3 American bombers were shot down and at least 2 others were seriously damaged. It was as if you could jump from missile to missile, they had fired so many, the brightness was such that you could read a newspaper in the cockpit, recalls one of the Americans who participated in the attack. Not an ideal start, the loss of so many B-52s took a toll on U.S. troop morale and reignited the North Vietnamese forces. Nguyen Van Phiet, a Vietnamese soldier who destroyed 4 B-52s, recalls the shock he had that night. "We were all afraid of the B-52s because they seemed invincible. After that first night it became clear that they could be shot down like any other aircraft. The second night of Operation Linebacker was much better for the United States. No shootdowns were recorded and only 2 aircraft returned with structural damage to their respective bases. That day, 93 flights were achieved, with a fairly high average effectiveness. The problem is that, by the third night, the Vietnamese had managed to figure out the strategy of the American pilots. The bombers flew in large columns on predetermined routes. Once their cargo was dropped, they would do a few turns, bank the plane, and then do a U-turn to return to their base. The moment in which the B-52s opened the hatches to drop the bombs was particularly sensitive, since they exponentially increased their radar signature, exposing themselves to detection by the SAMs. During the third night of the operation, 6 B-52s were shot down, sending Washington into a state of hysteria. Nixon was furious. That small country in Southeast Asia was inflicting unexpected damage on the fleet of the best bomber on the planet. Operation Linebacker 2 had been intended as a psychological blow to North Vietnam, but, thanks to Vietnamese victories, it was having the opposite effect. Since then, the flights have been carried out with variations in routes and altitudes, without once repeating the route used in previous attacks. During the fourth night, 2 kills were recorded. Thereafter, the United States improvised new tactics, and by the end of Operation Linebacker, a total of 15 B-52s had been shot down, with 33 crewmen killed. A grim aspect of these missions is that, when carried out at night, the bombers returned to a base in total darkness. It wasn't until the next day that the whole team found out about the colleagues and friends who had died during the night. The effects of Operation Linebacker 2 were devastating for both sides. 1,600 Vietnamese were killed in those December weeks, and many major bases were damaged beyond repair. To this day, the region is littered with ruined buildings and craters in the ground. On the U.S. side, not only did public opinion of the war worsen, but tens of millions of dollars in war material was lost and, for practical purposes, the operation achieved none of its objectives. North Vietnam remained operational and its soldiers were even hungrier for victory, and the American pilots were terrified to undertake another similar mission again. It did not surprise anyone that on January 27, 1973, a little less than a month after the end of the Linebacker 2 operation, the peace accords that began the long period of withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam were signed in Paris. In June 1994, more than 84 tons of steel crashed on the runway at Fairchild Air Force Base, located in the capital of the United States. The incident involved one of the subsonic strategic bombers of the U.S. fleet, the mythical B-52 Stratofortress. Photos of the burning machinery flooded the national and world news, but soon a veil of mystery fell over the true causes of the accident. Despite the attempt by the Air Force to seize all the videos of the impact, a recording managed to elude the strict control of the institution, revealing a history of negligence on the part of high-ranking officers. In this new military aviation video, we will analyze one of the most terrible accidents in the history of the United States Air Force, to understand what happened that tragic afternoon, when the crew of the B-52H found its final destination. On the morning of June 24, 1994, the crew of a Boeing Stratofortress bomber was preparing to perform a display that included a series of difficult low-altitude flights on runway 23 at Fairchild Air Force Base. The crew consisted of weapons and radar operator Ken Houston, and pilots Bud Holland, Mark McGeehan and Robert Wolf, who was making his last flight, which is why his family was at the base as special spectators. What they didn't know is that they were paying attention not only to Wolf's final takeoff, but also to that of all his teammates. Pilot Bud Holland was a difficult person. He had the rank of lieutenant colonel and had been the commander of the Standardization and Evaluation Branch of the 92nd Bombardment Wing, that is, he had extensive experience in complex flights. The problem is that, in the words of his own colleagues, he was an aggressive and irresponsible pilot who frequently violated safety regulations in mid-flight. His record included flying below minimum heights and exceeding pitch and climb limits. In fact, in 1991 he had already had a close encounter with tragedy, when a B-52 he had piloted circled over a softball field. The ship executed a 65-degree bank turn that was described as a death spiral as it went out of control for more than 300 meters before Holland managed to regain control of the machinery. In time, the entire United States would wonder why such a man continued to command demonstration flights with large aircraft, but it was too late to prevent tragedy. The B-52H took off at 1:58 noon and completed most of the flight plan with ease. Complications appeared when approaching the touchdown and takeoff maneuver, in which the plane hits the runway as if to land but takes flight again, quickly gaining altitude. The aircraft began the maneuver, but the Fairchild runway was occupied by a KC-135 tanker that had just landed. Consequently, the B-52 was ordered to perform a go-around, a maneuver similar to a touchdown, but without touching the ground. At that time Holland contacted the control tower requesting permission to execute a dangerous 360-degree turn to the left, which was immediately authorized. That was the final nail in the coffin for the 4 crew members of the Stratofortress. The B-52 started to circle around the control tower, but just behind it was a restricted area that housed a huge structure set up to store nuclear weapons. To avoid flying over that area, Holland maneuvered the aircraft into an extremely banked turn. Almost at the end of the turn, the bank went out of control and exceeded 90 degrees. The B-52 descended at full speed, crashing into the ground, immediately exploding and killing the entire crew. Although there were no injuries on the ground, those present witnessed an apocalyptic scene. The ship transformed into a ball of fire that raised the temperature around it as a result of hundreds of liters of JP5 fuel igniting. It took firefighters 3 hours to extinguish the flames, and when they did, the only recognizable part of the B-52 was its tail, the rest a grout of molten scrap. The day after the event, the U.S. Air Force immediately convened a security investigation under the direction of the Chief of Security, Brigadier General Orrin L. Godsey. The final assessment of the investigation was published on January 31, 1995, revealing what actually happened in the seconds before the disaster. Before completing the turn, the B-52 was flying at the indicated speed of 337 km per hour, but the effect of the bank was to produce a sudden reduction. Holland applied more power to the engines to maintain airspeed, but the craft's turbines can take up to 8 seconds to react to changes in acceleration. All 4 members of the ship had access to the speed indicator, which continued to fall uncontrollably, so it is likely that they knew their destination even before they hit the ground. A few seconds before the impact, the speed was just 269 km per hour, with an inclination of more than 60 degrees. Despite the crew's best efforts, the ship stalled in mid-spin, without having enough altitude to recover before crashing to the ground. The investigation also concluded that the chain of events that led to the accident were the product of the personality and behavior of the pilot Bud Holland, who, as we told you, had a long history of disobedience and problems with authority. He was a reckless man who liked to take things to the extreme, and that's exactly what happened in 1994. Many experts say that Holland was something of an addict to these dangerous maneuvers, since in many instances he had disobeyed direct orders to be able to make some kind of risky turn. In May 1991, Holland performed a demonstration with a B-52, during which he violated multiple safety regulations, including exceeding pitch limits, flying directly over spectators, and ignoring altitude restrictions. If you wonder what the consequences of that episode were, the answer is that there was none. Holland was not even reprimanded by his superiors. Although anecdotes about Bud Holland and his dangerous obsession abound, the most incredible case occurred in March 1994, when the pilot commanded a training mission that had to be photographed to document the capabilities of the Air Force. During the test, Holland violated all possible limits, being photographed in flights just 10 meters from the surface. The risk was such that the co-pilot tried to take the controls to stop Holland from flying so low, while the other 2 crew members yelled for him to go up. Bud Holland's response was to call them little girls. After the mission, the crew decided to never fly with the spinning maniac again and reported the incident to headquarters. We'll let you guess what the result was. That's right, absolutely none. Holland was unharmed after endangering the lives of his colleagues. His superiors chose not to document the complaint. This highlighted that it was not just the mistake of one irresponsible man, but of many power figures who knowingly ignored the blatant disrespect of one of their pilots. The image of the Air Force was completely tarnished, and although numerous military trials were held, none ended with penalties greater than a monetary fine. To make matters worse, the video that escaped the control of the airline was published on all the news in the country and abroad, exposing the shortcomings of the U.S. force in the foreground. To this day, that video continues to be an important case study for analyzing misconceptions in both military and civil aviation. Even the U.S. military itself has embraced it as a first-hand example of the importance of complying with safety regulations. In 1961, the involvement of the U.S. Air Force in the Vietnam War was only in support of the anti-communist republic. It flew in response to emergency requests and officially was not authorized to carry out combat missions unless there was at least one South Vietnamese crew member. However, between August 2 and 4, 1964, 3 patrol boats from the Navy of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, a communist regime, attacked 2 U.S. Navy destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. This incident provided the United States with the necessary excuse to fully engage in the conflict. From there, an escalation of U.S. retaliations followed by North Vietnamese attacks unfolded over the next 6 months. President Lyndon Johnson concluded that these missions were not sufficient because, in his words, it had become clear, unequivocally, that Hanoi was preparing to kill. So, what decision did he make? In the next few minutes, we invite you to learn about the most intense air bombing campaign waged during the Cold War, Operation Rolling Thunder, and why this marked a resounding tactical and strategic failure for the United States Air Force. Join us in this new installment of military aviation. After the Flaming Dart operation, in retaliation for the North Vietnamese attack on Camp Holloway, the Johnson administration requested on February 13, 1965, a program of action against North Vietnam. This marked the beginning of Operation Rolling Thunder. The main objective of this operation was to destroy the enemy's industrial base, transport lines, and communications to halt the flow of personnel and support material from Hanoi to Saigon. However, a controversial decision that may seem incredible, the White House prohibited U.S. air operations within a 15-kilometer radius around Hanoi. Furthermore, restrictions were imposed on the selection of specific targets within a larger 48-kilometer radius. Only Johnson, with advice from administration officials like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, had the authority to order air operations within that zone. These restrictions would prove to be very problematic. Rolling Thunder began on March 2, 1965, with only one mission per week, targeting the southern part of North Vietnam. During the first 2 years, aviators were also not allowed to attack the bases from which enemy MiG fighters flew. Rules of engagement continued to change. A target on the approved list one week could be off limits the next. From start to finish, Rolling Thunder was hindered by a policy of gradual escalation, which undermined the impact of airstrikes and gave North Vietnam time to recover and adapt. How could a successful bombing campaign be pretended while imposing limitations on range and objectives simultaneously? The reality was much more complex. The Johnson administration feared that a more aggressive bombing campaign would increase civilian casualties and could escalate the war by provoking the Soviets and the Chinese. The true strength of the enemy around Hanoi and Haiphong was not touched or even threatened. For instance, bombers were prohibited from entering the entire seaport of Haiphong because Soviet ships unloaded supplies and provisions there. In reality, there was a hidden objective, to dissuade authorities based in Hanoi, leading them to simply withdraw their support for the Viet Cong. Apparently, the White House expected this to yield quick results and was disappointed when it didn't. The United States did not want to get bogged down in a ground war in Asia. However, this was exactly what ended up happening. Faced with the strange and controversial U.S. strategy, the People's Air Force of North Vietnam responded pragmatically and intelligently. Knowing that U.S. rules of engagement prevented them from attacking certain types of targets, the North Vietnamese strategically placed their surface-to-air missile launchers just within these restricted zones. They covered a sufficient range to protect targets related to the transportation and supply system, which were located 48 kilometers from Hanoi. Interestingly, at the beginning of the campaign, North Vietnam's air defense system was not formidable and could have been easily destroyed. In fact, the first anti-aircraft site was detected on April 5, 1965, but U.S. pilots were not allowed to attack it. During Operation Rolling Thunder, the North Vietnamese fired nearly 5,000 surface-to-air missiles, bringing down 101 U.S. aircraft. However, it wasn't the anti-aircraft missiles that posed a threat to U.S. units. About 68% of the losses were due to artillery fire. By 1968, North Vietnam had 1,158 operational batteries with a total of 5,795 deployed weapons. The iconic aircraft of the U.S. Air Force during Operation Rolling Thunder was the now legendary F-4 Phantom II, but especially the F-105 Thunderchief, known to all as the Thud. It conducted 75% of the attacks but suffered more losses in North Vietnam than any other aircraft type. By the end of the operation, more than half of the F-105s in the Air Force had disappeared. And while it is true that most of the losses of U.S. aircraft were due to the inefficiency of dealing with anti-aircraft fire, the stain on the pride of the U.S. Air Force in Rolling Thunder came from air-to-air combat. How was it possible for the People's Air Force of North Vietnam, inexperienced in air combat, to be responsible for causing such dishonor? Like their jungle fighters, they patiently learned from mistakes and applied unconventional tactics. Until 1966, they focused on building an extensive network of ground radars, while their pilots gained experience with their MiG-17s and MiG-21s. Acting cautiously, Hanoi refused to commit their men to aerial combat unless the odds were in their favor. Thanks to this precautionary measure, only 28 North Vietnamese planes were lost in combat during this period. However, in early 1967, North Vietnamese pilots became overconfident and engaged American aviators head-on. They were gravely mistaken. On January 2, 1967, the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing commanded by Colonel Robin Olds, equipped with F-4 Phantoms, set up an ambush. Imitating the routes, call signs, and even radar interference capsules that F-105D Thunderchief used routinely for their bombings, they managed to lure and surprise MiG-21 interceptors, who did not expect the Sidewinder missiles launched by the Phantoms. In just 12 minutes, 7 MiG-21s were shot down over the Red River Valley in North Vietnam. Between January and July, U.S. Air Force fighters flying air-to-air missions shot down 29 MiGs and lost only 2 of their own, a death ratio of 14.5 to 1. The key to this success was the implementation of a force economy measure, using Phantoms that could be deployed for both bomb attacks and air combat patrols. These could ditch their air-to-ground weaponry and become air-to-air fighters if necessary. While this approach made sense at the time, it turned out to be a big mistake. Having lost half of their combat aircraft in just a few weeks between March and June 1967, the People's Air Force of North Vietnam began to lick its wounds. It entered a period of self-examination, training, and reconstitution before adopting a different tactic that created headaches for the U.S. Air Force until the end of the war. The MiG-21s applied a tactic of air guerrilla warfare. The agile Soviet-made aircraft stalked U.S. formations from the rear, fired their AA-2A Atoll missiles, and retreated. They either dove through the formation of U.S. planes, only to turn around and drag the enemy into individual battles. F-4 Phantom II pilots had to adapt to constantly changing rules of engagement. The most problematic for those escorting bombing runs was having to visually identify enemy aircraft targets instead of relying on their plane's radar, designed to give them an advantage only at long range. On the other hand, specific failures in Phantom's air-to-air missiles, combined with a lack of proper dogfight training for U.S. Air Force pilots, contributed to, in the last months of Operation Rolling Thunder, by the end of 1968, the enemy shooting down 22 U.S. planes at a cost of 20 MiGs. In all cases, the victories of the MiGs began from behind an unsuspecting target. This was a depressing turn of events, as the overall death ratio of the U.S. Air Force fell from 4.1 to 1 to 2.3 to 1. In January 1968, North Vietnam launched its Tet Offensive, attacking bases and cities throughout the South. It was not a military success, but it shocked the American public, and support for the war plummeted. The U.S. Air Force, unable to solve the problem of surprise attacks, considered that the success of future operations would be at risk. The Johnson administration then announced a partial cessation of bombings, eventually bringing an end to Rolling Thunder on November 2, 1968. It had lasted 3 years and 8 months, making it the longest air campaign in U.S. history up to that point. During this period, more bombs were dropped on Vietnam than on the entire continent of Europe during World War II. The Air Force and other services had conducted 304,000 fighter sorties, with a total cost of $900 million for the entire campaign, losing 922 aircraft in the process. It caused only about $300 million in damages. The strategy ended without achieving any tactically significant results. It did not persuade the North Vietnamese to abandon the war or halt the infiltration of troops and equipment from Hanoi into South Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder demonstrated that, due to its intermittent nature, political precautions regarding the Soviets, and the inability of the U.S. military to adapt to unconventional opponents, it was not designed for success. And ultimately, it did not succeed. As we reach the end of the video, we are interested in hearing your opinion. Do you think the decisions of the United States were justified? If they had attacked with more determination, would they have had greater success or provoked a larger-scale conflict? Leave your response in the comments below. That concludes today's video. We look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military Aviation.